Live from Los Angeles tonight, the next revolution will be televised. An angry America, an embattled president. Is populism going off the rails? And how do we get it back on track? Plus, the American dream under attack. We'll meet the man who says the elite are protecting their privileges while keeping working Americans down. And in Swamp Watch tonight, tax breaks for the rich. Wait till you see how the wealthiest cut their tax bill while you have to pay full whack. Evening, everyone, and welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. Now, over the last few weeks, I think you've got a sense of what we're trying to do on this show. Frankly, we're not really interested in the people, like me actually, who are doing well, those living in the wealthiest neighborhoods whose biggest worry is whether their, sushi order will be delivered on time. They can look after themselves. Good luck to them. The people we care about here are those Americans who've been left behind by the big changes of the last few years. Automation, globalization, immigration, the centralization of government and the economy. The people whose incomes are lower today than nearly 20 years ago, after 8 years of Bush and 8 years of Obama. The people whose jobs have gone away. The people who see the social fabric around them torn apart. The people who have completely lost faith in politicians and government. We're focusing on them, and we're trying to do it in a positive way. We're trying to avoid the partisan bickering that you seem to get everywhere else. We're trying to be intelligent and thoughtful. I'm glad you're with us. That's why this week has been so especially depressing for us here at The Next Revolution. It's kind of the opposite of the politics that we want to see. Our country seems so angry at the moment. Everyone assumes the worst of each other. People feel scared to say what they really think. We're not listening to each other. Of course, there are some views that no one should listen to, like the Nazi marches in Charlottesville. Of course, it's vital, as I said last week, for populists in particular to condemn the hateful fringe on the far right. And it's obvious that what the president said this week has entrenched or even inflamed divisions. You can see how divided we are by looking at this poll. 46% of Americans blamed the far right for the Charlottesville violence. 49% blamed both sides or the far left. Here's what I say. Let's get populism back on track by being positive. Let's work for a populist economy, economic security for every American, economic opportunity for all, not just the elite. A populist society where we strengthen families and communities. And populist government, where we drain the swamp of corruption and cronyism and put power in the hands of people. Mr. President, your supporters just want you to succeed and to make America great again. The way to do that is to stick to your populist agenda, to bring people together, and above all, to be positive. That is the next revolution I'd like to see. With me now to discuss all this, Rasmussen Report's political analyst, Amy Holmes. Also with us, California Congressman Brad Sherman, and investigative reporter for the Young Turks, Namiki Konst. Namiki, I'd love to start with you, if I may, because we've talked over the time, the last sort of few months and weeks, and I think that the thing I really am interested in is your view about whether, as a Bernie Sanders supporter, which you were in the election, you see any hope for that kind of populist economic agenda to help working people being delivered?
I really hope so. I mean, there are a lot of factions and a lot of wars going on both sides. So I'll back it up a little bit. You know, the events of the past couple of weeks, as horrible as they are, we have seen this in history, and we've seen what has led to this in history. Just a couple of years ago, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman warned that when income inequality is as great as it is like this, you have the risk of the far right, meaning the alt-right, tapping into using populism to amp up anger. And that's what we saw with the rise of fascism, 70 years ago. And we're seeing it again today. And I think that for Bernie Sanders, who is the most popular politician in the country right now, and this isn't about Bernie Sanders, but it's about the politics that he brought forward, and the next generation, which overwhelmingly sides with that type of populism, as you have said, you need to have solutions. And so from our side, I'm hoping that the Democrats come together and they have solutions as we stare in the face of fascism. Because if we are not delivering a positive populism, there's going to be a negative populism because people are hurting.
That's what I completely agree with, actually. I mean, really strongly. That's what we're all about here. I mean, do you think that there is a possibility for populism to be positive in the way that we've talked about? Do you see that as being a realistic
Oh, certainly.
option?
And, politicians, they work for us. We don't work for them. And it seems that a lot of politicians have forgotten this and forgotten the focus on middle-class Americans. Bernie Sanders tapped into this economic anxiety very, very well. I mean, who would have guessed that an independent, self-described socialist from Vermont would be giving Hillary Clinton a run for the money, which he very clearly did.
And so you could apply the same on the other side.
Absolutely, and I was going to mention something that is sort of ignored or overlooked or not even understood about President Trump was that early in the Republican primary, the reason why he was sort of cleaning up was he was actually getting Republican voters who were more likely to support raising the minimum wage, raising taxes on the wealthy, who were supportive of unions. I mean, a lot of Republicans said, I didn't even know we had them in our party, let alone that they would be giving the nomination to Donald Trump. Those are the people that Donald Trump was reaching. He didn't get conservatives until Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and conservatives, dropped out of the race. So if politicians can focus on this group of people who are not as ideological as the parties are in Washington, D.C., then I think we might be able to see some progress. I mean, there is a caucus in the House that is trying to, put together a bipartisan coalition of moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans to try to come up with solutions. We'll see if they can focus on their agenda.
Congressman, there's been a lot of focus on the split, if you like, within the Republicans and whether the president is even a Republican, and we've had a lot of conversation about that. But actually, there's a similar kind of split within the Democratic Party, the populists and what are described as the establishment and so on. Do you recognize that, and where do you put yourself in that conversation?
Both parties are coalitions. The Republicans are having a tough time now because the Mitt Romney wing of the party looks at Trump and they're aghast at what they see. And yet at the same time, they don't want to give up the voters that he brought into the party. Our problem has been that we've been insufficiently aggressive on the trade issue. If we had balanced trade with the world, there would be such an incredible labor shortage. They'd have to take your show off the air because, because what would happen is employers would buy all 60 Minutes for advertisements to recruit employees at higher and higher wages.
Someone around here would be
Actually,
happy with
interestingly,
that.
that's where Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump agreed, was on TPP and trade issues.
But defeating TPP is just the beginning. I mean, that's just saying
it's
no
not
to
the only
something
issue
negative.
by a long way.
What you need to do is require China to engage in balanced trade with the United States. They have managed trade on their side, and we have Wall Street openness on the other. And so even when we are able to export something to China, it's at the cost of they demand that we transfer our intellectual property to them, that we move our assembly lines over there, and then maybe we can sell a little bit in the Chinese market.
Can I just sort of stop you there for a second, because we haven't got a huge amount of time left, although one way or another we can get back to this theme during the show. I just wanted to hear your view on the plan that Chuck Schumer and his colleagues in the Senate put out the other week, particularly the part about competition, about breaking up companies and having a much tougher antitrust policy as part of a populist message. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think we need to enforce our antitrust laws, but when it comes to breaking up companies just because they're too big, that starts with the giant banks and financial institutions, because too big to fail.
Yeah, does it stop there? Does it stop with them?
I'd want to take a look at it. I doubt that the Democratic Senate leader has put forward anything all that radical in the antitrust
well,
issue.
I wish it was more radical. Anyway, we ought to leave it there.
But too big to fail is too big to exist.
Well, I agree with that. We've talked about that a lot here. As I say, more time to get to some of those themes later. But before we go to break, we have a Fox News alert for you. We're following two breaking news stories right now. First, a search and rescue effort in the South China Sea after the USS John S. McCain collided with a merchant ship east of Singapore tonight. No word on any injuries, but reports say the Navy-guided missile destroyer sustained damage to her port side. We'll continue to monitor the search and rescue effort and keep you posted. Also tonight, a live look now at Laguna Beach, California, just down the road from here, the site of another far right-wing rally attended by both the right-wing group America First and counter-protesters. Police there are out in force as well, making sure that both sides stay peaceful and no violence breaks out. This rally is just getting underway, but we'll keep an eye on it, and if there's any news to report, we will bring that to you. Coming up, Swamp Watch investigates why the wealthiest Americans seem to get the biggest tax breaks. And up next, what's happening to the American dream? Our next guest says it's being crushed by the elite. That's after the break. Welcome back to The Next Revolution. With me now, Brookings Institute Senior Fellow and author of Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That's a Problem and What to Do About It, Richard Reeves. I should also point out that Richard and I once worked together in the UK government, though not quite as closely as this, but that's a whole other story. Richard, you're originally from the UK. You can tell you're an American now by the length of your book title, which I appreciate very much. But could you explain a little bit what's behind your argument?
Sure. Well, I think the British thing is relevant, and as you know, as we are both British, I can say that one of the things I've discovered to my dismay is that the class system in the US, especially the top, is just as strong, if not stronger, than the one that we both escaped from in the UK. And I grew up hating that kind of obsession with class in Britain, what fork you use, how you talk, all that stuff. Yeah. I think we share that. I think is one of the things that we share in our politics. So it's actually been disconcerting to discover that, especially at the top 20%, the upper middle class of American society are actually perpetuating themselves across generations more effectively than in the UK. And so the numbers suggest the class system here is more ruthlessly effective than the one in the land of Downton Abbey and The Crown, which is, I think, rather shocking and disturbing.
So a lot of people, when we're having this conversation about what's going on, talk about the 1%. That's used all the time. You're saying actually that's misleading. It's much broader than that.
I think it's not
more like 20.
Not just misleading, but unhelpful. I think that we are the 99% is one of the least helpful political slogans of recent history, because it's allowed people who are doing really very well, people on $200,000, $300,000 a year, to convince themselves that they're really the victims here. And it is just the Wall Street bankers, it's just the people with private jets who are getting away from it. And that puts the line in the wrong place. So you can argue about the line, but I think that if you're comfortably into the six-figure incomes, this group has an average income of $200,000 a year.
The top 20%.
Yeah, that's the average income for that group. That's 4 times median income. And just looking at economic trends, that top 20% have increased their income collectively by $4 trillion since 1980. The bottom 80% by $3 trillion. So the whole of the bottom 80% have seen much, much less, and this is market income gains, much less market income gains than the top 20%. That's really where the line is.
But you're not just sort of describing it. You're actually saying that this is not an accident, that actually the people at the top there, the elite as we might call them, are actively entrenching their privilege and keeping other people out. How does that work?
I think in some ways they are doing it, hence the title Dream Hoarders, that they're hoarding the American dream. And you said at the top of the show, good luck to them, right? The people who are doing well, they're worried about their sushi. I don't think it's just luck. I think that the way the housing market operates, the way the education market operates, the way the tax system operates, which I know you're going to talk about, all of those are to some extent rigged on our behalf. So they're actually rigged in our favour. So it's not just luck.
Look at housing then. Let's just look at housing specifically. How does this work itself out in the area of housing?
Well, land turns out to be an incredibly important part of any class system. There's one reason why you say the landed gentry in the country where we come from, right? Landed aristocracy. In the past, the US has been a very big country in the sense there's been a lot of land and people have moved around a lot. It's getting more cramped, particularly in some of the metro areas where there's lots of opportunity. Land is getting very expensive, and it gets zoned in such a way as to benefit those of us who have expensive houses. Then along comes Uncle Sam to give us a tax break for doing it. Right. And then we have great schools that are available to our kids. And so, although I don't think anyone sat down and created this system in an evil genius kind of way, to say if you're trying to create a system to perpetuate inequality in a class system, I'm not saying that's what anyone did, but if you did, it might look a little bit like that. And so I think that just the regulation, so 19 out of 20 people now live in a city with regulation. Actually, the more liberal cities...
On housing?
On housing.
Right.
We have exclusionary zoning which is not justified on environmental grounds or any obvious social grounds. Really, honestly, it's about protecting the value of our homes, which are also tax subsidised. And at that point, you're rigging the housing market combined with the tax system in our favour. So it's not just luck. It's not just good luck.
No,
we have to look in the mirror here and say, look, to some extent, we have a responsibility for some of these practices.
I appreciate that. And I think that making this more of a political argument and not just talking about the financial income aspects of it, I think is really important, some of these structural reasons for the inequality. Well, we'll get to some of this a bit later on with the panel. But as I said at the start of the show, we like to be positive here. And one of the aspects of opportunity that Richard talks about in Dream Hoarders is access to college. So we went to see a fantastic program in Southern California working on that issue. Anita Vogel has the story.
What classes have you signed up for this semester?
I got chemistry.
Conversations about college Kia Eaton and her mother Margarita weren't sure they would ever have. But thanks to a program called Power for Youth, kids with various troubles at home or school are finding a way to change their lives.
We work with the kids that are most likely to experience academic failure. Our goal is to help kids to do better in school. However, it is not homework and tutoring as much as it is through mentoring relationships.
Students join the program as early as middle school. Once they get matched up with a mentor, they work one-on-one each week. Goals range from staying out of trouble to improving their grades. Diana Lopez's parents speak mostly Spanish, and they also spend a lot of time caring for her sister with Down syndrome. They weren't able to help her with her algebra, and that's where her mentor came in.
We would look on YouTube for videos of math and how to actually solve it. YouTube taught me another way, my mentor taught me another way, my teacher taught me another way, and I feel like the way my mentor taught me was so much easier.
Power for Youth has served 450 kids since the program began in 1999. Since then, more than half of these at-risk students have gone on to college.
I thought maybe I was going to be in jail or just doing nothing with my life.
19-year-old Luis Robles admits he was on the road to nowhere after his father got deported. He spent countless hours in detention at school until his mentor showed him another way forward. Now he's in college and wants to pursue film and social work.
What kind of an impact has this program made on you and your daughter's life?
Well, she got into college.
Single mom Margarita Davis couldn't be more proud of her daughter Kia, who is now studying to become a nurse. She credits mentor Kelly and her daughter's hard work.
I think it was that extra time that we spent outside, really digging into websites, looking at different schools.
Having Kelly and being in this program really pushed me that I could do more than what I thought I could do, and I could go as far as I want, and no one could stop me.
Power for Youth is the first of its kind site-based one-on-one mentoring program. But other cities around the nation are beginning to take notice of its success and are copying the model. Steve?
Thanks, Anita. And coming up, Swamp Watch investigates why the richest Americans get the biggest tax breaks. And next, Richard and I debate Dream Hoarders with our panel. All right, so we're back with Richard and the panel. I wish you could have heard our conversation in the break. Maybe we can recreate some of it now.
What is said in the break stays.
I know, that's a very important rule. I agree. Congressman, over to you. What have you got to say to his argument?
On tax policy, the only fight is between the platinum 1% and the silver 19%. 80% of the income taxes are paid by the top 20%. So when we talk about tax reform, and we want to get rid of this or that deduction, that's usually used to lower the top rate and to shift income from the person who's making $100,000 to the person who's making $10 million. But trade is a different issue. That's where the upper middle class does benefit, because when you can get an MBA who specializes in offshoring, and another one who specializes in marketing, and another one who can lobby for the trade policies that we have now, you can fire a whole factory. And if the lower middle class can't get the $30 an hour manufacturing job that allows their kids to compete, then we have $10, $12 an hour manufacturing jobs, and you have the separation that does worry me. Now, I don't know if we have the level of stratification that you talk about in your book, because only about 40% of the kids of the upper middle class are able to stay in the upper middle class, at least according to the studies I've seen. But whatever stratification we have is not justified. We need to shift our tax code, and we have to change our trade policies.
So I think on tax, I agree with you. I sometimes think that the most ferocious class war in America is within that top 20%. It's the hatred of the person on $200,000 a year for the person on $20 million a year. And in fact, on one of the Occupy Wall Street marches, a third of the people there were making more than $100,000 a year in their own earnings. And so I agree with you.
These Occupy kids were making $100 grand?
A third of the people on that one of the demonstrations.
Were they counting Wall Street because they were on Wall Street?
And it's all relative. I actually opened the book with the story of President Obama trying to change 529 college savings plans. Now, 90% of the benefit of those savings plans goes to the top 20%. It was outraged, and people were outraged. He had to kill it. He became the first president in living memory to ask his own party to vote against a part of his own budget before it even got to Congress. Why? Because the upper middle class, including the top 1%, but all of us in the top 20%, had a sense of entitlement around it. So I agree with you about tax policy. What we can't do is build enough of an agenda around redistribution and investment just on the shoulders of the top 1%.
Yes.
We do have to ask more of the others. And that brings me on to the next point, which is about trade. I agree with you that those at the top, we're insulated from free trade. And for too long, we've said on net and in the long run, trade is good. Well, that's true. But that means that for someone, now it's bad. And that's never us. It's never the people who are at the top of the distribution. I do think there's been a wake-up call around that.
The Chinese government has done a great job for its middle class because they have managed trade on their side.
Well, that
and
I
we have
completely.
disarmament on our
hopefully
side.
we're not going to become a communist country.
No,
Look,
it is a different middle.
Right.
Amy, come
I want to say I really
we do need to manage trade.
I really appreciated that you brought up environmentalism. You have to be pretty rich to be an environmentalist, okay? A Tesla is $100 grand to buy that car and up. If you're going to, have environmentally friendly groceries and you're shopping at Whole Foods, as you said, Congressman, that can take up your whole paycheck. And if you remember, as when President Obama was running for office in 2008, he gave an interview to the San Francisco Chronicle when it came out that he said that his environmental plan would necessarily make electric bills skyrocket. So,
I think there's a lot of hypocrisy around.
It's not just hypocrisy,
well, it's a big part of it,
pushing
isn't
this
it?
agenda, particularly in the Democratic Party, has actually run into opposition from unions. Keystone Pipeline, for example.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's a little bit of a transition there. I mean, in terms of fracking, for instance.
I want to move on. I don't want to focus on the environmental thing. I just want to get back to Richard's argument about the fact that so many of these structural reasons, the housing, the school system, parenting, is in the way kids are raised, all these structural things prevent the kind of social mobility that we want to see. Do you recognize those?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm an activist. I'm around activists all day long, organizers, and the pain that you hear from a lot of these folks right now is that they don't have options. They're not lobbying. They don't have, maybe unions are, but even then they're very disconnected. The workers are very disconnected from the union leaders. So when those inside rooms, as you know very well as a congressman, the conversations that are being had between the lobbyists and what's happening on the ground is completely different. In terms of education, fascinating piece, but in New York State where I live, the entire divide in the Democratic Party is over charter schools and public schools. Public schools aren't receiving the funding, and that's because our public school system is funded by
the trouble with having someone as interesting as Richard is that you have so many different lines of argument.
I do want to say something about
I'm sorry, we're out of time. We really
We'll have
strong environmentalists.
We'll have you back. We'll have you back and there's so many details that are so interesting. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
And with our country still in massive debt, why are the richest Americans still getting, as we've already discussed, giant tax breaks? A lawmaker from one of the nation's richest districts is here to defend it. Don't miss that. And now, on to Swamp Watch. You're going to hear a lot over the next few months about tax reform. But as you listen to the arguments, remember that our tax code is as much a part of the swamp as any other aspect of government. And the real scandal is that it benefits the elite at the expense of working Americans. Tax breaks for the rich are tonight's Swamp Watch. The state and local tax deduction lets taxpayers subtract the income and property taxes they pay to their state and county from their federally taxed income. It's one of the biggest tax breaks for individuals and saves taxpayers around $100 billion a year. So what's not to like? Surely we should be in favor of anything that saves taxpayers money. Well, yes, until you find out which taxpayers save money from this swampy scheme. In 2014, nearly 90% of the state and local tax deduction went to taxpayers earning over $100,000 a year. How much of it benefited working Americans? Just 1% went to those earning less than $50,000 a year. Remember that the median income in this country is around $50,000. That means half of all American households earn less than that. So 99% of the state and local tax deduction is going to the top half of earners. But it gets worse. Over half the money flowing from this tax break goes to just 6 states out of 50. Guess where they are? 20% goes to California for a start. And then look where it goes within those states. Here are the 10 counties that benefit the most from the state and local tax deduction. Number 1, New York County, New York, also known as Manhattan, also including Wall Street. Number 2, Marin County, California, also known as the place where San Francisco tech tycoons own their second or perhaps third homes. Although they don't need to worry that much, San Francisco County itself is number 7 on the list. And by the way, in third place is California's San Mateo County. That happens to be where I live. And I can confirm that my neighbors in Silicon Valley do not need a tax break from the federal government, especially when so many American households are struggling. President Reagan tried to get rid of this tax break for the rich in 1986, but backed off after howls of protest. Now, the Trump tax reform plan includes abolishing this elitist boondoggle. And predictably, the swamp has risen up in protest. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen the National Association of Counties, whatever that is, hiring expensive lobbyists, including ML Strategies and Cassidy & Associates, to protect the interests of the wealthy. They're joined by other establishment groups like the National Governors Association, the National League of Cities, the National Conference of State Legislatures, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Ignore their self-serving swampy spin. You know what the state and local tax deduction really is? It's a subsidy from the federal government to wealthy elites who shovel donations into the pockets of high-spending Democrats running places like New York and California, but who want to be protected from the economic consequences of their political posturing. Okay, here's another special favor our tax system gives the rich. You may have heard of something called the carried interest loophole. The idea behind this is to reward and incentivize risk-taking entrepreneurs who put their own money into investment funds. In exchange, the income from these investments is treated as a capital gain and taxed at a lower rate. Encouraging risk-taking and entrepreneurial investment. That's clean capitalism, and I'm all for it. But this tax break has been totally abused by the Wall Street elite for their own personal greed. Managers of private equity firms and hedge funds aren't putting their own money at risk. They're managing other people's money and make a commission out of it. That's their job, and the commission is their income. But the carried interest loophole lets them get away without paying income tax on it, like everyone else. This elitist tax break lines the pockets of the ultra-rich. In 2015, Blackstone's Stephen Schwarzman, worth $12 billion, made over $8 million from this scheme. The co-CEOs of private equity firm KKR, George Roberts and Henry Kravis, both billionaires, made nearly $5 million apiece. How do the Wall Street elite cling on to their tax breaks? Well, on top of actually sitting inside the White House, Blackstone made almost $10 million in political contributions and spent $3.5 million on lobbying last year alone. And money spent to lobby the federal government on tax policy goes an especially long way. A study conducted by University of Kansas researchers found that corporations hiring lobbyists to influence a 2004 tax bill made a 22,000% rate of return on their investment. If only they could deliver that kind of return to their clients. These swampy lobbyists, of course, make the most of the revolving door between Congress and commercial interests. Lobbying firm Capital Counsel were paid $70 million to push their clients' tax agenda. They proudly advertised the fact that 2/3 of their team went through the revolving door between Congress and outside lobbying. Capital Tax Partners made over $100 million to lobby on tax issues and actually boast that 11 of their 12 partners have Capitol Hill experience. Of course they do. That's how the swamp works. In the election, Donald Trump promised to get rid of the carried interest loophole.
We will eliminate the carried interest deduction, well-known deduction, and other special interest loopholes that have been so good for Wall Street investors and for people like me, but unfair to American workers.
Will he stand up to the swampy lobbying from inside or outside the White House and follow through? That will be a key test for his populism. While he's at it, he may want to take a look at more of the swampy special favors for the rich that are lurking in our tax code. Check this one out. Big businesses can write off the cost of their corporate jets. Take a bow, the National Business Aviation Association, which spent over $2.5 million lobbying the government just last year. But it's not just the skies that are swampy, our oceans reek too. Believe it or not, the rich get to subtract the cost of their luxury private yachts from their taxable income through, of all things, the mortgage interest tax deduction. That's supposed to help the middle class afford a home. But it covers second homes too, and unbelievably, it covers boats, as long as they have, quote, sleeping, cooking, and toilet facilities. So a billionaire can get tax relief on a luxury yacht, but that little skiff you take fishing, forget about it. Next time you hear some slick politician telling you how they'd love to cut your taxes, but you know, it's tough, what with a deficit and all that, tell them that simply limiting mortgage interest tax deduction to primary homes would raise around $10 billion. The scale of the corruption of our tax code is truly shocking. 2 weeks ago on Swamp Watch, we looked at big banks that agreed to multi-billion-dollar settlements to avoid prosecution for their crime. Now wait for this. Guilty companies can deduct some of the costs of those settlements from their taxes. So when you see headlines about Goldman Sachs hit with a $5 billion fine, remember they're using it to pay less tax. In Goldman's case, as much as $1 billion less. According to a Newsweek calculation, around $15 billion worth of taxes linked to the 2008 financial crash were avoided this way. They crashed the economy, work their swampy legal contacts to avoid jail, get a slap on the wrist, and then use the fine to cut their tax bill. This is the ultimate in crony capitalism, and it's killing support for the free enterprise system. If draining the swamp means anything, it surely means killing off these indefensible tax breaks for the rich. Joining me now, New York State Senator Todd Kaminsky, who represents New York's 9th district in Nassau County, one of the counties on that list of the top 10 beneficiaries of the state and local tax deductions. I just called that tax deduction indefensible, but you're here to defend it. Tell us why.
Well, thank you, Steve. First, I just want to state that my thoughts and prayers go out to the missing sailors in the Pacific right now, first and foremost. But the main argument that I want to make with respect to the tax issue is that this affects a lot of middle-class people as well. Because the truth is, property taxes are really hammering the middle class all over. So I represent, for example, 15,000 public school teachers in my Senate district. I have a lot of police officers, a lot of firefighters, a lot of regular middle-class people who pay really high property taxes. The median property tax payment in my district is $11,000, and that, of course, there are wealthy people in my district, but we have a big middle-class segment who's really hurt by this, and that.
What's your definition? Again, sorry to interrupt, but what's your, because these, as we were talking about in our earlier discussion, these definitions report. What is your definition of middle class? Because we've taken a look at the median income in your district, and it's way, way, way above the national average.
Well, you know, the cost of living is.
Are you saying that someone earning over $130,000 a year deserves a tax break from the federal government?
I think if you have a joint household where you have two hardworking people who don't have white-collar jobs, like a teacher and a police officer, for instance, they're going to end up earning more than $130,000. They will not be rich at all, and the cost of living is so high on Long Island that they will probably just be, figuring out how to get their kids to college and how to be able to afford retirement. So when you would take away that deduction from them, their taxes would go up by thousands of dollars and make
Who's paying for that deduction? Who's paying for that deduction? No, we'll have a chance to talk about that in a second, but who's paying for that deduction? It's the states that don't have any kind of income tax. You're asking for this subsidy from other people who earn even less. Well, we're all for lowering taxes. I agree with you. But why should other people pay for it who earn less than the people in your district?
Well, it's funny, you know, like I was a corruption prosecutor for the Department of Justice before I did this, and I certainly believe putting the attention on how things work behind the scenes in Washington, Albany, or any other capital is critically important. But the other way to look at this is that the states that would be hurt by this are states that didn't vote for the president, and since this has come out in a preview of a tax.
Exactly. Exactly, and the reason that why are taxes so high in those places? That's why this is so that you get all these howls of protest, because basically the places that benefit from this are Democrat-controlled areas with high spending that they've been protected from the consequences of by this deduction.
Well, we in New York have instituted a tax cap. We're trying very hard to limit property taxes, but it's my job every day to make sure that the hardworking people I represent are able to keep you know, a certain amount of the hardworking money they earn so they could fulfill their dreams, and having this deduction go away would be devastating to them. They want to see their money go farther and the government invest in their communities and have their tax dollars mean something.
I hear all that, but why don't we got to leave it there, but why don't you instead, why don't you tell your Democratic colleagues to spend less, and then taxes wouldn't be so high in the first place? Anyway, thank you, Senator. And coming up, the panel's been listening, and they're already trying to get in. Congressman's got some views. We'll hear from you in a second, and that's coming up after the break. Don't go away. Okay, now let's get our panel's take. The Congressman was dying to get in just in our discussion. Now, you go for it.
I think you said that the effect of eliminating the state and local tax deduction is going to mean less spending. That means we won't be able to have the free colleges that we have here in California. It's a Reagan-Ryan attempt to squeeze local government and make sure it can't help the homeless, make sure it can't provide college education or a good K-12 education. Second, you're assuming that median income is the same in Idaho and in New York City. $100,000 is a very different thing. But finally, you point out that 90% of the benefit goes to those who make over $100,000. Well, those who make over $100,000 pay roughly 90% of the income tax. So it's a proportional, not a disproportional.
Well, look, I'll take the middle point about cost of living. I think it's a good point. But I think on the first point, I just want to get to you in a second, maybe. I just want to say that surely we want accountability for the spending. So it's not about squeezing it. It's saying the people who spend the money should be accountable locally.
There's plenty of accountability here in California because most of what the taxpayer pays, they don't get back in a deduction. They fight hard to make sure the government is efficient.
They can basically pass it on to the federal government. So
it's not a credit, it's a deduction. There's a difference.
Amy.
So I'm not going to give you the Gordon Gekko greed is good speech.
Thank goodness for that. Okay. That's a relief.
But I think you really hit on the point that I care about, which is I don't think that the federal government needs to raise more taxes. I think they need to cut spending, and I think a lot of Americans agree with that there is so much waste, fraud, abuse, projects that don't need to be funded by federal dollars, that we could go through that on that side of the ledger, I think, and fix a lot of the problems of the tax code. But also you did hit on something that I agree with in terms of the fairness of the tax code. When you see people who get the carried interest deduction, for example, that they get to list their income as investment, and they have a different tax applied to them than everyone else, that only creates more resentment. That only creates more of the negative populism that you're talking about. And then I would also, my last point is there's a difference between tax breaks and tax cuts versus tax reform. And I think you could get a big bipartisan coalition on tax reform.
I mean, that's actually one of the things that Bernie Sanders, a lot of people would be surprised how much he advocates. He doesn't call it tax reform, but he talks about aspects of our economy where taxing is not fair and we're not spending properly. The federal budget, we could have a long conversation about all the money that we spend on defense and how little of it we spend on education and other services. But to go to the Congressman's point about, if we are squeezing the middle class so much, we are, you were talking about we're spending too much money. Well, if you look at the social programs that conservatives complain about all day long, when you squeeze the middle class, that's what forces people to go on those social programs. If you are working a hard, job, like Senator Kaminsky's district, which has a lot of working class voters. You have policemen, you have school teachers, a very large teacher population in Long Island. If you have those people who can't afford the basic necessities in life, and they're forced to go on social programs, that's the worst of both worlds.
I totally agree with you there, and I think that's why our early guest, Richard, talking about the structural reasons that the cost of living is so high, especially housing, is so important. Sorry, we've got to leave it there for the moment, but we have another chance in a second, because coming up next we'll get some final thoughts from our panel. Don't go away. In a moment, final thoughts from our panel, but first a quick programming note. Next Sunday, we're going to bring you a Drain the Swamp special, including an exclusive interview with notorious lobbyist turned anti-corruption campaigner Jack Abramoff. I'm looking at the clock. We've got less than a minute. Quick thought.
Wall Street has been lobbying against unions for 35 years. That is why we have this rise in populism. We have to go back behind the workers.
And right-to-work laws nationwide, and Trump has the authority to impose tariffs on Chinese goods. That would force them into a balanced trading relationship with the United States and create a labor shortage in the United States.
And last word to Amy.
You can get bipartisan support for partisan populism when it focuses on the middle class.
That's what we're trying to do on this show, but join us next week for the next revolution.